Hello and welcome to Enter the Boardroom with Newroll, the podcast exploring what makes great boards and board members. I'm your host, Oliver Cummings, CEO of Newroll, the board search specialist and market leader bringing science to the art of board hiring. Today's guest is Simon Calver, best known for his time as CEO of LoveFilm International, where starting in 2005 he grew the business and led its sale to Amazon. He then went on to be CEO of Mothercare plc in 2012, where he worked on implementing a transformation and growth plan, accelerating its development as a multi-channel retailer. Simon has since served on boards across consumer, tech and digital businesses, including as chair of Moo and Firefly Learning, and as a senior investor at the British Growth Fund, where he was a founding partner of BGF Ventures. Simon has since served on boards across consumer, tech and digital businesses, including as chair of Moo and Firefly Learning, and as a senior investor at the British Growth Fund, where he was a founding partner of BGF Ventures. He currently sits as a non-executive director at HSBC UK, chairs Marks & Spencer Financial Services, Vinteria, a scale-up, and Microlab, which is a University of Leeds tech spin-out. Previously, he was chair of the UK Business Angels Association. Simon, welcome to Enter the Boardroom.
Thank you very much. Glad to be here.
Can we start by talking about your extraordinary growth journey at LoveFilm? The story's been well documented, so I don't want to rehash it. But looking back now through a board lens, what do you see as the three key board level strategic choices or tensions that most shaped the outcome, particularly where maybe some directors disagreed?
I think I was as blessed at LoveFilm, where I sort of had the great and the good of the early VC industry, right? And that often made quite interesting discussions. If you've got an Index and a Boulderton and a DFJ and all those around the same table, right? You can get a little bit of that whole dynamic of the idea du jour, coming through. But I think one thing that worked really well, right? And then I'll talk about one of the more challenging things is the introductions that they had. I mean, they were global VCs, and very early on in my time at Video Island at the time, and I'll talk about that in a minute, I got an introduction to Reed Hastings. I flew out to the West Coast and sat down with him. And by the time we got to the bottom of the second bottle of wine, it was, I was brave enough to ask the question, so what on earth are you going to do internationally? And he said, well, I'll probably wait to see who wins between Video Island and LoveFilm and sort of work out, what our M&A strategy is. So literally on the plane back, I wrote the business plan for merging LoveFilm and Video Island, where I was at the time. And you had a great combination of a very strong brand and consumer proposition and a very strong operating business, one with a stronger balance sheet and one with a stronger, marketing platform, and eventually managed to get that through. And I don't think that would have happened if I hadn't had that trigger. From, okay, how do we make this win? How can we make this a win-win for both of us rather than a win-lose, which is where we would have been. So I think that was a really, really good stage. The challenge with merging those two businesses, you had very different structures and cap tables, and we had to flatten both share classes to have common shares so that when they came together, it was a straight merger, almost 50-50 is how we did it. And that required a lot of tension with some of these people around the VCs around the table. I mean, they were brilliant. We got there, but I think it would be suffice to say there was a little bit of blood on the wall in that process, but everybody sort of took the higher ground in the end. Right. And one VC in particular, George Coelho, who helped lead us through that. George is, very experienced, ex-Boulderton benchmark, etc. And we got there. Right. And as a result of us having a share class and then LoveFilm having to do the same, we were able to merge those two businesses together. But I think that the question for me is that everybody lent into the difficult decision rather than kicking it down the road. And often what does happen, and I've seen happen time and time in boards, is actually, well, we're not quite ready to make that tough call yet. So, let's delay it. And if we hadn't done it then, and if we hadn't got the momentum from putting those two businesses together and getting the best of both worlds, we wouldn't have had the momentum at the stage that the market was accelerating. And I think we would have lost out. The other challenge that we faced is as we worked through DVD rental, and hopefully people do remember, DVD rental. Some of you on the podcast will remember DVD rental, but clearly this streaming download thing was happening at the time. One of our partners that was on the other side of the merger, part of the deal is that contractually we used their service to provide downloads. The challenge with that is that downloads wasn't the winning solution. If you think about the time when early on, people had to save something to their memory to watch it at a later stage. And so streaming was where it was at. So we had to have a real sort of, almost come to Jesus meeting in a board meeting to say, look, I know we have this contract and I know it, but if we continue to pursue it with you as a shareholder, right, we're actually going to lose out as a business and we're not going to create the value that we need to. And so we all had to sort of sit together and say, okay, right, this is what it means. We had to rip up the contract and start again with a different type of solution. And, again, it was hard, but there was a degree of maturity in the end that actually people realized that the size of the prize was worth it if we got it right.
3 great moments there. Can I go back to the Reed Hastings comment? So what was the board involvement in that? You come back from this session drinking a couple of bottles of wine with Reed Hastings, and you walk into the boardroom and you say, look, I think we've got to do a merger with our biggest competitor. And then they said, great. How did that work in practice? And what was the message that you took to your counterpart at LoveFilm?
Well, I think the first message was good luck, right? Because actually, again, there had been tensions between the boards of these two companies. And but Thomas Hogue, who was the major shareholder with Arts Alliance Media in LoveFilm, took some convincing. And we had to do a lot of work jointly on what that plan could look like. And where the boards came in is they came with what I would call constructive challenge rather than finger pointing. And we did something which was really quite unusual at the time, with the full support of the board, which is we appointed one set of advisors for both parties. And they became our independent sounding board, which is, come on, guys, and helped us through what typically is quite difficult. So doing private to private mergers or transactions is really difficult. You've got egos in the way. You've got 2 sets of founders. It's really difficult to make happen. But actually, I think we put with the board structures, we put the structures and the framework in place to enable us to have the right conversations, and having one set of advisors rather than 2 whose money and job it would be to create tensions. Just think about divorce lawyers, right? Divorce lawyers make their money by creating tension between 2 parties, right? And actually what we didn't want is that. So we had one that we did, and the board were supportive of through that and challenged us to get the best possible plan we could. And actually they both put a bit of money in at the same time to help fund this new business that was clearly pretty exciting and became on a very rapid growth trajectory afterwards.
So that sounds like a couple of nuggets there for a board member listening who might find themselves on a board of organization in a similar position. Number 1, appoint one advisor to bring both companies together, and 2, make sure the new entity has got the funding to deliver on coming together. What else would you advise that person listening now who finds themselves facing that situation you were in order to make sure it's successful?
Get on with the team early. Make the choices about the team early, right? And decide what that's going to look like, because leaving it till after something happens and, politics comes into play becomes really difficult. I would say that's key. Also, understand what your red lines are and write them down and articulate them. What was clear for Arts Alliance Media was the LoveFilm brand was the most important brand. We delayed the discussion about the brand, which one was it going to be, quite late in the party, because everybody has a view of their baby, right, of how pretty their baby is. So, but I think before we did the deal, we had to say, no, let's write down, these are the principles of what we're going to happen and what we're going to do, and stick to them as you then begin to implement, so you don't get any of that, sort of anxiety or post-deal issues that you have to try and work through.
In my experience of structuring complex deals like that with multiple parties, the way I've seen them work best is when you have one third party who is corralling everybody together and pushing people over the line, a sort of honest broker. What was the grease that oiled that transaction, and any lessons from that for a board member listening?
Yeah, it's a really interesting question. So I'm a huge fan in having independent non-exec chair. Right. I think it's wrong for investor directors to be chairs of companies. And, that's, I think, why it works. And Charles Garassa was ours. Charles at times, sort of had to pick up the phone to some of the investors and say, look, we've got to make this deal happen. And if we don't, this is the consequences of it. And Charles and I worked really well across, I think, all the investor base. And that's where having a chief exec and a chair aligned behind what you could agree how you're going to tag team certain things, and being really explicit about the messages you're giving. You have to work very closely and tightly in those situations, including, bear in mind that we also had Amazon on the board when we were trying to do the final deal. So we had to create, a subcommittee of this that wasn't the Amazon word part of, at the same time that we had to convince Amazon that we had many alternatives, including IPOing the business, which in reality was always going to be a tough ask. But, we had a couple of other. So at the time that we were having discussions with Amazon about buying the business, I was in sort of the West Coast trying to speak to studios. And it's interesting what's happening at the moment in the press when you read about Warner's and Netflix and everything else, trying to drum up alternative plan Bs so that we could keep that pricing pressure on. And it took us a while to get to the right price, but we did get to the right price because we had alternatives, or at least we had the perception of alternatives.
If you could go back in time and sit on that board now as an independent director, what's the board contribution you'd give to yourself as a CEO that you didn't get at the time?
I think early on, take someone like Danny Reimer from Index. I mean, he was absolutely brilliant. He said, look, Simon, we're backing you. Tell us what you want to do and we'll tell you whether we want to do it or not, right? But we're backing you, right? So from the early days, they were very clear, and that was incredibly empowering for me as a chief exec to know that I had the support of the investors behind us doing some things. And that at times made us make some pretty radical decisions, like investing £2 million in a Scottish TV test when we had £2.5 million in the bank, right? And having an underwritten response from the rest of it, which is if it doesn't work out, we'll continue to fund the business. So that was great. So I can't fault the support that we got in those situations. I think what becomes really difficult and challenging is when you're in the last throes of some deals, right? And we had some pretty major shareholders who suddenly flipped from what was best for the company to what was best for them, right? And understandably so, right? How do VCs make their money? They make their money on the way in and the way out, right? And it wasn't any of the large VCs, right? But it was individuals who had significant shareholding that actually just made life a little bit difficult. And I think that could have undermined our negotiating position somewhat, I think, with Amazon during that stage. And we sort of had to, almost dismiss it or not include it in any of the discussions until it's typically 4:30 in the morning or something that you sign these deals, until the last half hour when it was disclosed, and it was too late then to get in the way of anything that we needed to do. So I think that support through, all the way through to deal close, I think is really quite hard to get, because ultimately a bit of vested interest for some shareholders comes into play at certain times.
Can we move on to talk about customer centricity, because that was one of the other things came up, where so many organizations talk about it becoming more customer centric. But I'm curious to hear, for you, what are the one or two board questions that reliably tell you whether a business is truly customer centric or just saying it is?
I want people to be bringing customer view into the boardroom. It's like the old adage, the cliche of we've got an empty chair in the room and that's the customer, right? Who's talking about the customer, and actually who's representing the customer views so I would often say to the, chief exec, in smaller companies, founder selling is much more important as well, right? People want to see the founder, they want to drive that. But as the company gets larger, clearly that doesn't scale, right? So what I want to see is I want to know when people have seen customers. As a board, I would probably want to have, if it's a larger company, a customer event at least once a year, maybe a dinner, where you get and you hear from customers themselves. And again, I know they can be cherry picked, and I know they can be people's friends, and all those other things. You want people around the table who can challenge and give honest views. And HSBC do that really well, a couple of times a year with the board, with customers, corporate, and and retail, right? So I think who's bringing it in, but ultimately, it's not about the data. It's about the insight that comes from the data. What are we going to do different with the knowledge that we have about how customers are thinking? And I think that becomes really important, that people may say, well, our net promoter score was X, or our Trustpilot score was Y, or our customers think this. And the answer that from a board question point of view should be, what are the implications of that? I would like, an exec team to clearly articulate, we sell X to customer Y, and they buy because of Z, and they pay X price, and this is why they come back. And that's a simple sentence that you really want everybody to be able to articulate, that they understand the customer cohorts, they understand who's buying, why they're buying, and what the value add is.
What else is there, someone listening who's on a board where they want to drive more customer-centric thinking in their organization can do to foster that?
Appointing an NED, on the board as the customer champion, I think defeats the objective of what you want, because everybody around the board table should own, the customer, and the customer experience and outcome. I think active scoreboarding, right, to ensure that it's visible, seen. At LoveFilm, we used to have in our reception our customer complaints, and we used to have by root cause of those customer complaints. We used to send an email out to all members of staff every Friday afternoon to say, these are the top positive responses, and these are the 5 negative responses we had from customers. And I bet your bottom dollar, most Fridays by 5 o'clock, the 5 negative things were fixed, right? Because everything was transparent, we were open. What tends to happen as a business gets larger is that, divisional heads or functional heads or whatever begin to own the customer data, right? Nobody should own the customer data, right? It's transparent. It should be fully visible for everybody to see, and everybody has a part to play, and I think has the right to ask as many questions as they can about customer data.
If you're listening to these conversations and thinking, I'd love some support as I build my own board journey, that's exactly what the Enter the Boardroom community is for. It's the destination for current and aspiring board members, offering practical guidance, trusted insight, and a high-caliber peer community to help you build a credible board portfolio and succeed in today's boardrooms. Listeners can get 10% off. Head to etb.newroll.com and use the code ENTER at checkout. That's etb.newroll.com. Can we move on to talk about your next role after LoveFilm? Because you went on, after a successful exit at LoveFilm, to become CEO of Mothercare, but left after around 2 years. When you first joined Mothercare, how did you and the board define the problem Mothercare was facing?
I think it was pretty clear that it was a turnaround. We'd had 2 or 3 previous years of profit reduction, to the extent that it became hugely negative. Right, like for like sales were down, margin was down, and the UK business in particular was in bad shape, and needed to change. The constraints we probably had too high cost. Well, we did have too high cost base. We had long leases on stores. The business not that long before had acquired Early Learning Centre. And you had the macro tech changes going on of people buying online. At one stage we had something like 85% of all people who were buying furniture or nursery goods would look online in store on their mobile device while they were looking, right? So, you had all this, you almost had in your face price comparison, going on. For historically, what was Mothercare was built on trusted advice, specialist products, right? 1961, 50 years worth of business that have been going on. So we had to make some assumptions about what that turnaround was going to look like, and therefore we had to make some real assumptions about what the plan was. And before I arrived, they sort of employed the great and the good from the consultancy world to look into the detail of that, and they had what seemed like a pretty robust plan. The part of the challenge is that literally the week before I got there, I didn't have a CTO, I didn't have a head of merch, didn't have a head of buying, didn't have a head of marketing, and the CFO resigned on on literally the week before I got there, right? So you had no executive, other than, to build on, and you were trying to do a turnaround in this environment. So a lot of the early days was trying to build that team that could actually make this happen. And there was a big gap between some of the layers in the organization. And so therefore, I think some of the assumptions around how quickly growth could get back, how quickly margin could get back, didn't work out to be right. And at the same time, you had a supply chain that was creaking, that wasn't, operating as quickly as it had. The easier stuff to do, we all know, as a board, you can point your finger to this, is let's take cost out, right? And that's the easy stuff to do, and we did that, right? Share price went from £1 to £4, within the space of 9 months to a year. And, on the back of that, we then begin to realize that the margin improvement, the margin had gone from flat to -3% to -6% year on year in the previous 3 years. And the plan was it was going to stay flat. And the truth is, actually, it went from -6, which was the low point, sort of just before I joined, to -3 to flat. And that extra gap was a lot of profit in the business and a lot of cash that then couldn't be deployed against unprofitable store closures. So it was a real challenge. And I think that what it required, after we'd had that initial success, it required a change of the plan. And as I've seen in many situations, is that if the board is wedded to a plan, it's hard for the board to change the plan, right? And especially in a public environment, right? And actually, when is a good time to change? The truth is, the good time to change is the moment there's an issue, right? You've got to do it quickly and lean in and make that change. And actually, the degree of change that was required was, I think, significantly greater than people realized. And I think that I talked about it a bit earlier, which is kicking the can down the road. When you reach situations and there are extreme things that need to be done, you need to act swiftly, you need to be brave, and you need to be bold, and you need to make some of the tough calls really, really quickly. And often, look, we're never in a situation where we have 100%, answer. It's always sort of a blend of an answer. A lot of research, and I sort of do a lot of understanding of, well, in my coaching work now, is that often the issue is not what decision you make, but how you lean into the decision that you do make. And as a board, I think the onus is on the board to be decisive rather than, as I said, kick the can down the road or wait. And it's up to the chief exec and the exec team to be and present credible alternative plans that are decisive and bold in what they need to do. Because you can't save yourself to growth, and you can't, hope has never been a sound strategy, right, in terms of what you need to do. And I think that was a classic situation of where probably leaning in and being bolder was really needed early on.
So what is the lesson in practical terms for a board member from that? So sure, leaning in, I guess they lent in on the plan that they'd already got behind, and what they failed to do was to step back and reassess the situation or challenge you as CEO to present some alternatives. Or what can someone listening to this take away from that as a tangible action that they can implement in their own board?
I think the key thing is be really clear about the assumptions you're making that will determine the success of the plan, and constantly revisit those major assumptions. Right? I think we were doing okay on like-for-like growth, but that was coming at a promotional cost and a margin reduction that meant that the cash wasn't being delivered as much as it needed to be delivered. And so growth was there, cost out was there, but not all of the assumptions behind the plan about gross margin, about product and supply chain. At the same time, the international business, which was the cornerstone, which is a franchise-based business rather than a store-owned business, had none of the overheads of the store estate and could actually scale and grow very quickly. And the question there is at what pace that could grow and how could that accelerate. So there are probably 3 or 4 really big strategic levers that needed to be front and center of every single discussion that we were having at the board to ensure that we really understood. And the moment we began to see that fall off, the moment that we weren't maybe getting as much growth as we wanted internationally, or that the gross margin wasn't being delivered for whatever reason, then actually carrying on with the same plan is not the right thing to do.
And I think that's always a tricky one for board members to know, when you just need to allow more time for a plan to come to fruition versus, this is an intelligent failure where our hypothesis is not panning out and therefore we need to pivot.
Yeah, it is. But I think that comes from just, asking the questions and being open to that change in the boardroom.
And do you think that sort of comes down to having a chair ultimately who keeps holding the board's feet to the fire on that question? Or is that on the CEO, or is it a collective responsibility?
I think that there's an interesting story. So I was speaking not so long ago, a few years ago, to somebody who was a chief exec, and they were saying, I can't speak to my chair. I can't tell them what's really going on. I'm afraid about doing this, and there wasn't the environment in the board meeting. I think it's the responsibility of the board, and in particular the chair, to ensure you create the right environment where big issues can be discussed, right? Where it's not fear, but it's actually, there's adult to adult discussions going on, everything about, rather than parent-child discussions going on that enable us to talk about the right issues. And that CEO was gone within 6 months, and that business was in administration within 12, right? And I think there's a lesson there, which is about, it's not for the, board to come up with the solutions, but it's to create the environment where those actual, actions are being able to talk about in the appropriate way.
It's interesting. What you're saying there is it's both creating a psychological safe environment, which podcast Amy Edmondson talked a lot about, but also about creating the opportunities to surface issues that can then be discussed in a psychologically safe environment. I've always really liked, I think it's Reid Hoffman's Dorian Pulse device, where he gets everybody in advance of the board meeting to surface the 5-10 things they think are critical and that should be discussed, and get them all to sort of upvote or downvote each other's items as a way to make sure there is that constant feed in to the board agenda.
I think it's a great point. The other thing that I do from a board management point of view, so over time, is please don't start with a page turn, right? Start with the strategic discussions that are really important, right? First conversation should be what's on the CEO's mind and what is he most worried about, right? And do a deep dive into those to help understand. You can do the financial pack at the end, take the board papers as read. You can do all those other things that you need to do, but the strategic issues, the most important issues, when you've got energy, engagement, and everybody focused in the board meeting, that's when you should be having those discussions. And typically, I think it's changed a lot in recent years, but historically it used to be, right, let's do all the updates first, and then let's save some space for this strategic issue and talk about it. And you run out of time. You don't have any, the appropriate time to talk about it. And actually, by that time, most people are switched off or bored or exhausted, right? In the board meeting. So, think about people's energy in the board and when you have it. And if people are better in the morning, have the board meeting in the morning, right? So it's thinking through, certainly the chair and the chief exec, thinking through those issues and ensuring that you're getting most out of the board discussion.
Let's move on to talk about your time as an investor director, because you've since sat on numerous boards as an investor director. And I was fascinated by a recent survey that came out suggesting the average net promoter score of a founder for their board is around -40.
Yeah.
And the average net promoter score of investor directors for the way their founders run their board is about the same, almost -40. And it just sort of struck me, what product is there out there that has a net promoter score of -40 that has continued to survive? I mean, this must be one of the few as a structure. And it's one of the reasons why we launched our pop-up board offering, because we feel like the board is fundamentally flawed as a structure for many organizations. But you've sat on both sides of that table, both as a sort of CEO and as an investor director. What do you see as the issue that's going on there that a board member listening who's experiencing that can do something about?
I think that trust and safe, haven is hugely important in terms of the board and the discussion that takes place. So, you want to be able to have a discussion with people, right? I think there's two things that typically going on, and I've seen time and time again. The first one is the moment that the founder gets challenged about something, they get incredibly defensive, right? I'm sure you've never been there, Ollie, yourself, right? You get incredibly defensive, right? And you give 27 reasons why that the board director doesn't really understand their business, right? And it's very different. And the other is also true, is I've seen, board directors who probably don't know the business as much as they could give 10 things that the chief executive needs to go and do differently than they're doing at the moment, right? Neither of that works, right? And I can understand that. What happens is the founder then thinks that the board's a waste of time because all I get to do is told, and I have a successful board if I don't come away with any actions. I've heard that said a few times, right? And the investor director is, oh my God, I wish they'd just understand some of these issues and questions that I've got that, that never seem to get answered, and it never really changes from board to board. So, there is a dynamic there that where you've got to stop and you've got to say, right, how effective are we operating as a board? Right. And one of the key things is just begin to have that dialogue. Right. So I spent a bit of time actually in more recently with boards, helping them understand how to make this work, which is what's going well. Right. Well, what do you want to see in the founder? What do you want to see more of? What do you want to see less of? Right. What's going well and what's not going well? Right. 4 simple questions. And if you ask, each of the board members those 4 questions about that, you'd have, probably 3 or 4 themes of what needs to change. I think defensiveness, typically, transparency, in too much detail or in not enough detail, right? It often comes out, and you'd have an equal and opposite view from the founder. So you'll only overcome those by actually getting into the room and having a sensible discussion. And there are behaviours that investor directors are doing, which is causing that defensiveness. And there is behaviors that the founders are displaying that is causing the investor directors to feel the way they do, right, in terms of defensiveness, that neither is taking responsibility for, right? And so if that situation occurs in the board, the answer that I as a board director should be asking myself is, what am I doing that is not creating the right atmosphere in this board where we can discuss these issues? Or why am I not able to have those discussions? What am I doing and displaying as behavior? Or what is we as a board displaying as a behavior, right? The board's a team as well, right? We very rarely think about it this way, but the board is a team, and it needs to get to know each other and trust each other and have dinner together and, laugh and cry and do all those other things that teams do together, right? And I think that's an important thing that we need to ensure, continues to happen. But I think the asking ourselves the honest question of what am I doing in my behavior that's causing this, right? And, there's some great chimp-like behavior and there's some great other behavior that's going on that is actually causing half of these problems to start with. And people need to take a step back. At Moo, what we used to do is we used to, at the end of every board meeting, everybody went around the board table and said, right, out of 10, how would you rate this board meeting? And what could we do better and what could we do worse? And actually that real-time feedback is a really interesting way to do it, rather than waiting to a board survey or an online survey that happens once a year, if indeed it does happen at all, right? So, I think as a chair, and if you're a SID, you need to sort of ask these questions and lean into them as well, which is, how can we make this board work better? What's not working at the moment? And what do we need to change in order to make that work better and to create that net promoter score? Now, the trouble is, right, is that when you're managing performance, right, if people aren't managing performance, often I bet you that net promoter score would be significantly improved if businesses were doing well. The trouble with investor directors is the number of companies that you invest in that hit their investment case is like hen's teeth, right? And that's part of, but that's, you've got to recognize that when you're making the investment, right, in the first place, so that it doesn't become personal.
It amazes me. We do that, what went well, even better if, and score of the meeting after every executive meeting. I don't understand why every board doesn't do it after that meeting, because it normalizes that improvement iteration. And so it destigmatizes things that are not working well. Though interestingly, we also do it at the end of our chair masterminds that we host, and most of the time, actually, people engage really well with it. But there was one occasion recently where I think one of the chairs sort of commented, "Well, this was an excellent session, and it was going really well until you asked the what went well, even better if," because that's just management guff, and nobody really ever engages with those things, which I thought was a really interesting perspective and has not been my experience of it. Curious to hear if you've ever had that pushback.
No, I've had people who felt uncomfortable doing it, right? But I think it's not wokeism gone wrong. It's actually genuinely, what can you do to improve? When I sort of coach people, and I actually, let's say it's an exec or a founder or something like that, and I speak to the rest of the board and I get feedback and I present them with the feedback, 80% of it they know, right? But they've never had it clearly spelt out in the way that actually this is now in front of me and I know I need to do something about it. And so, I would encourage people to have that discussion and to ensure they're doing board surveys and they're getting detail to build the right culture. Now, that's not to say that performance management is not important, right? That's not to say you hold people accountable when they say they're going to do it. It's not to say that in an exec board, operating board or whatever, you're not holding each other accountable to what needs to be delivered. Yeah, that's really important that you do that, but you do it in a way where people can talk about the problem, and they can say, this is the problem I have. This is what I'm struggling with. This is how I need to change it, right? What can we do to fix it? Rather than people either not bringing it up in the first place, which is often the case, or people feeling defensive when they do bring something up.
So time has flown, which means it's time for the lightning round.
Okay.
I'm going to ask you a short question and ask you for a quick response if you're ready.
Okay.
Best book every board member should read, and why?
Other than my book, clearly, on LoveFilm, I would say The Chimp Paradox, because I think we often get caught up and it's our chimp we take into board meetings and we've got to leave them behind and we've got to focus on what's really important.
Steve Peters, classic. Most impactful question you've heard in the boardroom?
The third question. And the reason I say this is because it's easy to ask one question or a second question in a boardroom, but often people duck out of asking the third peeled back question, which really gets to the nub of the issue. And I think is probably one of the most important questions you can ask.
The 5 whys.
Exactly.
What's a boardroom myth you think needs busting?
Is that everybody's on the same page and everybody has the same objectives, because often they don't, especially when you got an investor, directors and, management, etc. So even though it's talked about a lot, when you dig into it, it's not there, and you need to address that early on.
Boardroom behavior that irritates you most?
Stopping an exec CEO doing their job by telling them what they should be doing. Because what happens is they have no ownership of the outcome. If it doesn't work out, they point the finger at you and turn around and say, well, you told us to do it. Or do not asking questions. That's the other one.
Most valuable board ritual?
Start with the most important strategic issues and give them time. Leave the page turning till the end.
Favorite quote?
I don't know who said it. I use it often, which is, if you can't get to where you want to get to with what you've got to change.
Most significant professional insight?
That people issues do not get better with age. I've never regretted moving early on a bad performer, but I've always regretted moving too slowly.
Worst professional advice you ever received?
Never trust your board.
What have you changed your mind on about boards over time?
Well, actually, when I did my coaching qualification, right, we did a lot of active listening, understanding, and that was a huge transformation for me in terms of just bringing basic skills to the boardroom that actually you would often use in coaching to bring the best out of people.
When was the last time you got a significant judgment call wrong in the boardroom, and what did you learn?
I think often I've had heated views around too many conflicted views. I think, and as a board, you need to sort of respond, not react. So what would I say the judgment call was? The judgment call was believing that a product was going to deliver what it didn't do, but the customer insight wasn't there to validate it.
So the lesson is make sure you got the customer insight.
Yeah.
How are you better today as a board member than when you started?
I think I listen more actively and I use questions to drive ownership and solution rather than telling.
And finally, 3 things our listeners should take away from this episode if they take nothing else.
I'd say the board is a team too. I think we touched on that. If you expect high performance, you need to work at it, right? Be clear about roles and responsibilities and write them down, right? Don't just talk about it. Create an environment which is safe to ask the difficult questions or raise the difficult issues. And then talk about them adult to adult, not parent to child. I have 2 teenagers. I know how that works. It never works. What's the other thing I'd say is, look, tough things happen in business. Running a business, especially a startup or scale up, is really hard. And it's how you deal with those and how you react as a board that determines success, right, as you operate. So doing the right thing and taking others with you is really important.
Simon, thank you so much for taking the time to share your experience and wisdom.
Absolute pleasure. Great to meet you again.
If today's guest has got you reflecting on your own board journey, Enter the Boardroom community is there to support you. Designed for emerging, developing, and established board members, the community brings together expert guidance, structured programs, peer connection, and access to real board opportunities, all without noisy networking or false promises. It's informed by Newroll's Board Insight, but focused on helping you become a stronger, more credible board member. Listeners can get 10% off. Head to etb.newroll.com and use the code ENTER at checkout. That's etb.newroll.com.